couple things that come up for me as Holly was sharing, and I've mentioned to you before, Aviv, the work I'm doing with two other artists called The Studio. And we created this model. And again, you know, it's not that it's rocket science, to bring that metaphor in here, but what we did was we looked at how art making has a process that involves all these things that we've been talking about today. And we said, okay, well, can we create a model for this so that we can see how art making is actually in everything? And so we came up with this thing called the Circle of Artistry, and it has, you know, kind of elements, phases, whatever. It's iterative. So, you know, and Holly, as you were like just gesticulating with the circle here, I was like, wow, you know. But there's the, you know, there's the impulse, the idea of, okay, I want to create something, or I have a question, or I have a niggle, or I got smacked upside the head, or whatever. There's an initiation first of the creative process. Then there's the actual creation. So now we're in it, and we are bringing everything we have to bear on it. And if we're good, this is our opinion anyway, we don't begin editing yet.
Yeah. Because
if we edit too soon, it involves all those things that Holly's talking about, the ego and the worrying about what other people think, and, you know, like, and it interrupts the creative process, that sort of like pure space of creating something from nothing. And then is refinement. Once we move out of that, then is refinement. And then we have two things that happen after that, which is offering, giving it out to the world, and then responding to what they say to us in response. And what's interesting about that is that I remember, again, you know, being a student of my own work, my own poetry, my own process. And, you know, I joke around and say, you know, like, I went to MFA school, then it took me 20 years to get over it. And I don't, I value what I experienced, right? I'm grateful I did it. And I also had to unlearn a whole bunch of things. But one thing that was really important to me as an artist was, there is a difference, I think, between the space where you are actually creating and revisiting and refining, and then when you decide it leaves you, then it's not yours anymore.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the idea of like, do we keep a poem or a piece of art that was reflective of our younger self, our younger psyche, our younger consciousness, whatever that is? I mean, I think it depends. I think we have to, I think we actually have to step back about 6 steps, and then we become the critic, the art critic, the poetry critic, the editor, whatever. And we look at it and we say, well, does this have a place in my world of art, my world of things I've created? Or is this something that I needed to do because it transformed me into the person I am becoming? And so it was a point along the way, but I'm not putting it in the book. Doesn't need to be in the book. And so I think those are like such different questions, you know, in terms of like, but all of them transformational and transformative by nature.
Absolutely. And I wanted to just, something you said, Libby, I wanted to underscore also. I everything you just said was, yeah, but also that that creation is happening all the time. It pains me whenever I hear people say they're not creative.
Mm-hmm.
And my shorthand response to them is usually, have you ever solved a problem? I think, oh, you know, I feel like if you're a parent, you are by definition creative. But people have this concept that they think creative means artist, you know, or musician or poet, and so they just have this limit that they put on their self-concept that I think is so unfortunate. So what you're describing, Libby, I think it's so important to get that understanding, and also what you were saying earlier about that, you know, how unfortunate it is that we've separated education into these 2 separate tracks. You know, we've got art, we've got science, as if they're not different facets of the same impulse. So thank you for your work on that. That's fine.
Well, so let me ask you both, does it feel on to share any piece of writing? And if yes, please.
Yeah, Holly, you go first. I'd love to hear a piece from you.
I'm going to share, as you can imagine, I was dancing around over the last few days, like if I share a poem, which one does it want to be? And different ones were popping up. But I'm going to share the title poem from my book. And I'll explain why afterwards, because it relates to this question of at what point in time in one's own evolution as a poet, do you just sort of say, okay, that one's done, that one's final. The book is called Pluck Another Apple, Eve, and Finish It.
Great title, by the way.
And more about that after I share the poem. And the poem title is Gloria Mundi. On this otherwise undistinguished evening, a man at the garage collects money in a 4x5 booth with a rickety heater. His accented "thank you" passed across gloved hands. A child paws the velour of a pup's ear, wrestling in an uncoordinated tangle. Hatchlings. Somewhere off the Kona coast, porpoises are racing for the hell of it. Who knows? They could all be God. Something mightily bare-skinned and brilliant, as like to us as the David to the marble that waited for so long, hovers in the world. Pluck another apple, Eve, and finish it. We are all promises, watching to see how we will keep ourselves.
Lovely.
So thank you. So that poem, that line, that last stanza, pluck another apple, Eve, and finish it. We are all promises, watching to see how we will keep ourselves. Landed in my mind in the middle of a workshop, a week-long workshop on out-of-body experiences, sponsored by the Robert Monroe Institute that I attended at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in celebration of my 50th birthday. Okay, so the whole week had been about expanding and experiencing other states of consciousness. So that it just like pluck another apple. I heard it, I went, write that down. And then I wrote the rest of the poem to go with it. Now, what has shifted over time is the question, who knows, they could all be God. To me now, I wouldn't write it that way. But at that time, that was a big opening for me to just sort of see like, oh, it could be everywhere. Well, now I take it as a given that it's everywhere. But back then, that was a big step for me. So that was one where I just said, who do I want to be in this poem? I was like, no, this one wants to be as it was. This one really wants to be as it was because it's still alive. There's still that message. Trust it, let it be. And then it ended up being, it's still one of my favorite poems. And when I share it with other people, I can see the effect that it has on an audience. They just sort of go, women, of course, totally love the pluck another apple, even finish it. But also that just the whole thing does whatever it's going to do. But for some people, it seems to really strike a note. I go, okay, and that one wasn't really a struggle because I loved it as it was. But that's an example of that kind of engagement. And also that kind of, sometimes it just comes to you. And you're so right, Libby. Like if you don't write it down, it's going to find someone else.
Yeah. I love that poem. Thank you for reading it. And I hadn't read it yet, although, it's like best book title ever. But now I have to share a poem that I was thinking about sharing because the poems end in a similar way. And that just blows me away, actually, when I think about it. But before I read that, I want to say, because I think you're onto something here, that the way that I've always, I think what we do is, specifically poets, not that it doesn't happen with others, but but I think this will make sense to both of you. So if I live this fully human, alive life, open, aware, tuned in, whatever we want, however we want to describe that. And then I decide that I'm going to write the capital T truth as much as I possibly can. Then what happens is it transcends my little life. It transcends the little I and becomes the big I, which is why when you have a line like that or an image that someone can recognize, it's not about you anymore. But the thing that's tricky about the creative process, for me and for many others, I think, is if I try to write the great American novel or the best poem ever or whatever, I don't get to the truth of that thing that will transcend me. And I feel like, you know, that's why sometimes we can look at a poem maybe we wrote in a particular period of time and say, you know what, no, it's okay, because that actually isn't about me anymore. It's about, you know, the truth telling I was trying to get at, you know, from my experience as a human being. So I feel like that's kind of part of what I experience when I hear your poem. So I'll share this one and I'll say a couple words about it, and then you know, it would be fun to hear Aviv's sort of like take on, you know, these two that we've brought. So this one is called Threshold. And, you know, I'm obsessed with thresholds because you're no longer, but you're not yet. And so that liminal space for me is endlessly fascinating. It's kind of like moons. I can't get enough of either of those images or ideas. And there's the only thing I would say is that, like, so I use the word love in it. And what I'm hoping when people hear it is that it's the biggest expansion of all that when you think about that. And I also feel like this is more of a, like, someone hits you in the side of the head kind of experience with the creative process. So Threshold. It's not the sort of thing you plan for. Falling to your knees in the name of a love which you may never recover. But while you're down there, you might as well pray for something other than what you thought you wanted or deserved, maybe grace or mercy. Maybe a small sliver of light at the top of the tiny window lined with blackbirds and crows. You think you know what it will take to rise. But here's where things go. The bow makes music seem easy across the strings. But it takes years to get just the right touch, just the right angle of elbow and wrist. Just then you realize how impossible this might be. The phenomenology of crossing over and all the things it takes to learn to love a love that cracks you open like this again and again. You make a promise to yourself, and for once, it holds you to it. For once, it sets you free.
We could do this all day. I think we've got poems that want to talk to each other. Yeah.
Well, I enjoy these last few minutes receding here to the background and being in the presence of that beautiful poems.
That's wonderful.
Each on its own. And there is something to be said about poems are never one in comparison to another, because each is a universe unto itself, as each life is. Here is what is arising for me in what you both shared. Poetry is like making love, not just with language, but with the place from which language comes, the emanating source that enables language and perception and meaning and the flow that we recognize as conscious life. That's what I'm hearing. And the second, perhaps, dimension that is apparent in listening to both of you reading poetry, and I'm still with this conundrum, Holly, that you're describing, the elasticity of time. And who am I inside the elasticity of time? Am I the person that was the conduit of that appearance sometime in the past? Am I the witnessing today of that awareness, and I can hold that awareness and honor it from today at a whole new level and allow it to be as it is? Or am I the person that will now use the awareness of today to actually update and bring the poem to a new currency in itself? And I am, perhaps you are, the successive, all those slices of who you were through this elastic time and what that allows. So what I'm hearing here is the poetry of who we are becoming. That's what I'm hearing. The poetry that is the Golden Gate Bridge on which there is the traffic of life that is forever in the transit from who we were to who we are becoming to who we will be tomorrow and later on the other side of the veil. That is what I'm hearing, the poetry of who we are becoming through these. And perhaps that is the longing and the haunting and the yearning to forever be in touch with that eventuality in the here and now. So whatever way you sense into that, time is no longer linear. Time is a property that has omnipresence and reversibility inside it. We are way outside the easy frame to follow, but that is where I will skate with you with your poems and what they suggested.
Thank you so much for this rich and robust, conversation. It feels like the intention that we had to connect and meander and wander and circle back. And when you were talking about how time wasn't linear, I was seeing all these interconnecting kind of helixes, and I feel like that's kind of where our conversation about poetry and transformation went today.
I feel the same, and I wanted to thank you for that poem, Libby, because every poem presents a threshold. The whole process. I mean, thresholds are everywhere. That's such a powerful image, and that fullness, that most magnificent possible interpretation of love, which can show up so quietly.
Thank you.
So you have taken us today into the midwifery that poetry is, which is another way of talking about a threshold. And the other sense that I'm accessing in these last few minutes is indeed how the universal reveals itself inside the personal. So when you're able to magnify those moments that you just shared, where something spoke through you to fashion language in a particular way, where there is a transference of a perception and an actuality and a truth about life in a way that can be received by another person and experienced inside their own cognition on their own, separate from you, the conduit, the poet. It means that there was something in the personal that allowed the universal to be accessed through. So that to me is another aspect of the babushkas, the Russian dolls of life, and how the universal is allowed to be manifested through the personal. So thank you very much for bringing that to life here today.
I just wanted to thank you both for this opportunity. This was delightful, and it's going to continue to cook in me. But the image that you brought up a few minutes ago, Aviv, of the bridge, is one of the central images of my own sense of what and who and how I am. And it's one of the few that has been persistent, that I tuned into when I was young and still feels valid for me. And the dilemma that it carries continues. And this is part of what it expresses in poetry, which is being the bridge and then actually getting to cross the bridge, and somehow needing to be able to do both. And I think the poems can be, and the beautiful thing about the Golden Gate Bridge is like that image you raised, like, if I am the bridge, but I'm also creating an opening for me to cross, well, everybody else gets to cross it as well. But sometimes there's that tension, like, okay, I'm holding this space for others to be able to make this transition. I'm creating a threshold for others to be able to cross, but when do I stop holding that space and cross over and not revisit this place again? So I know that sounds a little bit abstract, but for me, it feels like a very embodied, ongoing question that I occasionally express in a rather demanding and upset way with myself or with life. And I think that's one of the realms that poetry gets to explore. And it's just one we hadn't mentioned earlier, but I wanted to bring that in. It's just that threshold image is so potent. It's one of the things that we serve as poets. We create those thresholds. And then sometimes you go, okay, would somebody hold the door for me?
Yeah, that was a great image. And I actually, there were a few things that came to me in it. One was, just the whole metaphor of bridge building and crossing over, and then I was like, and then we need the things so we don't jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Like poetry, poetry, it keeps me sane. And I think that's an important thing to mention. There are practices that we, whatever it is, whatever our creative expression, creative practice is, like, it's so we can cross over. It's so that we can move from this to that. It's so we can transform, and we don't jump off too soon. We don't abandon it. And I think that's just really important to mention that it's important and lofty and beautiful, and it's hard sometimes too. That's one of the greatest, it's the full human spectrum contains grief and loss and despair and joy and delight, and and we're transformed by it all. And I think that's the bridge, And
this feels just the right place to leave this unfinished, right on the bridge, suspended. Thank you.
Thank you, Aviv. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Livy, and thank you, Aviv.